Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and it's time to do one of my favorite videos of the year. In this video, I am going to share with you and try not to gush about all of my 5-star reads for the year. Every book that I read this year that I love and that I would just recommend to anyone, whether you like reading or not. Just read these books. Do me that favor. So this year I decided to break them down by loose sort of genres, shall we say. So let's go ahead and get started because I've got a lot of books to go through. So I'm going to start out, since I'm releasing this video on Christmas Day, I think, with Christmas books. And I have 2 of them. The first one is, I feel like, a classic, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And while I feel like there's nothing special about me recommending this book, I do have to say it is great. Somehow this was the first year I've ever read this book, as far as I can recall, and it was every heartwarming, good, Christmassy, healthy heart lesson that I could possibly want. Healthy heart just sounds like it's good for my blood pressure. It might have been that as well. Anyway, if you have not read this classic, I highly recommend picking it up. And I agree with everybody who has said before me that this is a great place to start with Charles Dickens. It's a little awkward of a place to start if it's not Christmas time, but since it is right now, read it. And the second book that I'm going to talk about, I actually have here on me, and that is The Tale of the Nutcracker by Alexandre Dumas. I have a bind-up edition of it, but I'm sure you can find this as a standalone as well if you want. This was such a good Christmas story. I recommend this to anyone who likes a good fairy tale. It just has those classic fairy tale vibes with like the princess and the prince and rescuing and people being morphed into other types of creatures and who's going to save the day and where's the trick and who's the evil person, good and bad and all the things, fighting, battles, adventure, everything I also love about Alexandre Dumas. So that's a good place to start with him if you don't want to start with The Count of Monte Cristo. But honestly, start with The Count of Monte Cristo because that was a really good book. All right, next I'm going to go with historical fiction, which is going to start to also bleed into literary fiction because I'm basing these genres on the story graph and I couldn't decide which ones these really were. So let's just say some combination of the two. And the first book I'm going to talk about is Augustown by Kei Miller. This is a book that is set in Jamaica and covers basically what goes on in Augustown, this little incorporated town that's now part of Kingston in Jamaica, at least as in the time period that this book was written. It is all the things magical realism, or is it? I don't know. I listened to this on audiobook. It was really good on audiobook because you got the singing, you got the accent, you got all things together. But either way, this is a really deep, moving story, well-paced, really quick and to the point. And yeah, I can't recommend it enough. Another book that I love, including its cover, this would probably be the book that I would say is like best cover of the year, would be The Lion Women of Tehran. This was just such a moving story, such an interesting trope where you have 2 friends growing up. There seems to be some miscommunication. You're going back and forth between their childhood and their adult life. You really don't know what's going on, but you want to find out. And let me tell you, when you do, it is worth it. It moves along well, so I don't feel like it drags out that trope of getting to know them. And there is another book that I read this year that was very similar to this, but I have to say this is the one that got the 5-star from me. I really enjoyed it. It was a quick read. I read it over summer, but I just felt like I learned so much about Tehran and part of its history in a very short period of time in a very concise story. So if that interests you or you like historical fiction in general and want to do some historical fiction from a part of the world that maybe you don't normally read from, I know I don't, this would be a great book. And then I feel like everybody else, I read James this year and it was a 5-star read for me. And we're not going to talk about what it did and didn't win, but I did tab this book. I read it as part of a comparative / syntopical read with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is hands down the better book and it stands well in its own right. Though I have to say, I think I'm going to be in the minority of people who are saying, read Huckleberry Finn first, or read them together, but don't read the one without the other because I think you're really missing some, especially from Huck Finn, if you don't read them together. But it really does enhance the reading and the enjoyment and the pleasure and the awesomeness of this book if you've read the other one first. And then definitely on the more literary side for sure, because I can't think of much about this book that's particularly historical, I read Hell of a Book. This is a book I read earlier this year. It's been on my shelf for a while, and I think I originally picked it up because it won the National Book Award. This was an amazing book. This was one of my biggest surprises of the year. I don't know why. I think just because it won the National Book Award and I don't feel like I've ever heard anybody talk about it, even the year that it won the National Book Award. And maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, but if you own this book, pick it up and read it. It is great. It covers the story of a writer who is an African-American male trying to understand like what he's kind of being forced to write about, dealing with his own struggles, his past, and this mysterious young boy shows up on his book tour, and things go a little strange from there. It is not a linear storyline. There are definitely things about it that feel like magical realism or some sort of fever dream, or who knows what's going on, but I don't usually like those things, and in this case I did, so I think you might as well if that's not usually your thing. Just give it a try. It reads very quickly, and it was extremely well paced. Apparently that's something that I really like and want in my books this year, and I got it with this book. I had another 5-star literary fiction book that I want to mention that for some reason I can't find, and that would be The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I have to say, in looking at my full list of 5-star books, this is the only 5-star that I sort of question. I really enjoyed this book. I listened to it as an audiobook, though I do own a physical copy. Again, who knows where it is, but it wasn't somewhere super easy to find. I should probably fix that. Anyway, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This is another book that I feel like I heard talked about a lot. It was very hyped, but then I started to hear very like hit or miss things about it. And unfortunately, by that point, I already owned it. So it came up during my TBR game sometime this year, and I decided to just go ahead and read it so I could at least unhaul it. And I really liked it. I do think some of that had to do with the audiobook, because I did have a couple of moments in listening to the audiobook where I thought, I don't know if I'd like this as much if I was reading it physically, because it was a very slow-paced book, and it seemed like the kind of book that maybe shouldn't have been as slow-paced as it was. However, as an audiobook, it worked well for me, so if you also have heard mixed things about it, maybe give the audiobook version a try. That said, I thought this was a very interesting book with what feels like should be a fairly predictable sort of trope going on, but I found it very unpredictable and quite enjoyed that about it. Moving on to sci-fi, I again have another book that I can't find. I'm really starting to wonder how I organize my shelves, because it should be by alphabet, but apparently it's not. Anyway, that book would be Jennifer Government, and this was a dystopian sci-fi, and I would also say predominantly a satire of capitalist governments and what could happen in the world if capitalism just really went rampant in like the most horrible way imaginable. That said, it was still managed to keep humor throughout. It was a very satisfying read, very fast-paced kind of thriller action vibes going on, and yeah, tongue-in-cheek throughout. So if you want to read maybe a more lighthearted dystopian novel, can such a thing exist? I don't know, but this book is it. Next up in sci-fi, I have Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is another book that I have heard a lot about, and let me say it lives up to the hype. This was such a deep novel that was not your typical dystopian, even though it had elements of that dystopian vibe going on. It went to places I wasn't expecting in terms of just the themes and the topics, but I will say if you don't like themes that explore like theology, then you may not like this book. There's no one particular religion in here per se being explored, but you definitely have to be willing to think about faith and want to listen to discussions on faith, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I really enjoyed it and apparently like that in books, so I give it 5 stars. One of the books that really kept me chuckling and laughing throughout this year was The Martian. Again, this book has been very hyped. It is worth it. It is as funny as people say it is in the most bizarre way possible. And for a science fiction novel that does actually have a decent amount of math and science in it, like I wouldn't say it's light science fiction, I'd say it's somewhere in the middle, it still retains a lot of humor. There were no dry moments in this, and you did feel a sense of excitement and like wanted to know how are things going to go and happen. And I just realized I'm not really telling you a lot about what any of these books are about because I would take way too long. So really the point of this video is just to give you an idea of books that I would recommend, and that would be all of them that I'm mentioning in this video, so that you can look them up and learn some more and maybe give them a try yourself. And if you do so, get this one. This one was really good. I apparently also really like my sci-fi to be funny. But if you don't like your sci-fi to be funny and you prefer your sci-fi to make you bawl your eyes out, then I would recommend Doomsday book by Connie Willis. I read last year, I think it was, To Say Nothing of the Dog, which is the second book in this series. It actually doesn't matter which order you read them in. They're both just set in the same universe. I think this book does technically happen earlier than the other book, but the storylines, the characters, nothing are related to one another. Just if you like the premise of time travel that this is based off of, you get 2 books for the price of one. Not really. They're both going to cost you money, but you get 2 books that use the same device. How about that? Anyway, interestingly enough, the second book, To Say Nothing of the Dog, made me laugh out loud and laugh so hard I started crying. This one just flat out made me cry. This was such a moving story of like the time of the plague. It has to do with pandemics, and maybe it just hit too close to home. I don't know. I thought I was in the past, but yeah, maybe this could trigger some PTSD. But it was just, you just got so invested in the characters. Connie Willis does such a great job with her characterization. She does such a good job with her storytelling. Her books are kind of on the chunky side, but they don't really feel long because there's just so much going on. You're following it all. She keeps you invested. The pace keeps moving along, and then she just rips your heart out and stomps on it. That was this book. If you like to cry or need to cry, pick this one up. I even have some recommendations this year for some of the younger folk. So if you're looking for a good YA novel that's definitely got some Gothic vibes, but you're not ready to jump into Jane Eyre or anything written in the Gothic period, I would recommend Marina. I don't own that book. I got it from the library while I was in the middle of moving this summer. Like, my list of books I need to buy is definitely about to increase because this is one of them. Marina was such a good story. It definitely has Gothic vibes. So if you like Gothic stories or spooky stories or stories that have something mysterious going on in the background and that are definitely going to creep you out, this is one of them. It would be a great story to read at Halloween time. I'm a chicken. I didn't do that. I read it in broad daylight in the summer, and it still scared the crap out of me at one point. But it is just a really well-told story about a young man living in Spain, I believe. And yeah, this wonderful, beautiful girl that he runs into and their adventures together while something really weird and creepy is happening in the background. The atmosphere in this book is just so well written and put together. And yeah, there are even hints to other stories that I've read that I just loved and enjoyed and picked up on, but I still didn't know what was going to happen at the end. So it has that bit of mystery in it as well. And on a less creepy note, I read a middle grade this year, and it was a book that I've read over and over and over and over again. And I swear, I think it actually gets better every time. And that book is The Phantom Tollbooth. I did this as part of a Barnacle Buddy read-along, I think in the month of July. And oh my gosh, did this book like live up to its awesomeness. And the funny thing is, I had already read it again earlier this year. So I actually read this book twice. That's how good it is. And in fact, it's so good, I was looking forward to reading it the second time when I read it. And it was only like 2 months apart that I read it. And yeah, I loved it. I've always loved it. I've loved it since my childhood. If you have not read this book, I don't care how old you are, you need to pick up a copy and read it. If you have any children surrounding you, read it to them if they can't read for themselves, or read it yourself and then give it to them. Do something. Like read this book. I did read 2 nonfictions this year. Oh my gosh, who am I? Because I'm typically not a nonfiction reader, but somehow it worked out this year. One of the nonfiction books that I read this year is The Radium Girls by Kei Miller. This book was so good that it has made me want to read the rest of what Kei Miller wrote. Somehow she manages to take what is already an interesting subject, write about it as nonfiction, but make you feel like you're reading a novel. This book was intriguing, fascinating, explored really well and in detail what was going on with the Radium Girls, but really focused on the women more than just Radium itself, which I feel like is sometimes like mistakes that nonfiction can make. I just fully appreciated that she really shared the story of these women and what they went through as part of working with Radium, how they were lied to, how they were injured, and how they overcame all of that. There are pictures in here. She tells the story very concisely, I think, even though it's a bit of a chunky book. And I really enjoyed this so much so that I had to make sure I had a copy of it. And yeah, this is definitely a book I could see myself rereading. There's also apparently a play or a musical of the Radium Girls, which I found out because my best friend's daughter happened to be in it. Interesting side note. The other nonfiction book that I read is William Styron's Nat Turner, 10 Black Writers Respond. This book got a 5-star from me, not only because the writing was excellent, the points were valid, and it is a well written and put together book overall, but because William Styron's book is also fairly popular, and I think this is a book that needs to be read more frequently. I also think it's a book that needs to stay in publication or needs to be reprinted because I feel like it's not in print anymore. Anyway, I was able to get hold of a used copy. I read all 10 of the essays, and I am so glad I did. It was just very helpful in confirming not just what I thought, but even introducing some ideas and things that I hadn't thought of. There were some things in there that I disagreed with, but it just helped contextualize the entire publication of William Styron's book and its reception, and particularly why it was received negatively at the time, though I think the reasons it was received negatively at the time are all still valid today. Thus, I think this book needs to stay in print, and I think is worthy of mentioning and bringing to your notice. And that brings me to my final genre, which is classics, which is just, I don't know why that's a genre. There's genres within that genre, but anyway, it is the biggest stack of books that I have, and we're going to start with Wilkie Collins. Why? Because these are all his books that I read this year. Clearly, there's something going on here. So this year I read Basil, I read The Evil Genius, Miss or Mrs., and The Woman in White. The Woman in White was the only one that was a reread for me, and I loved it even more than the first time I read it, which was back in high school, and I just misunderstood what it was going to be about. I was misled. That's how I'll put it. But all of these were 5-star reads for me, and I would highly, 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 highly recommend that you read them. I can't say that enough. I personally just love Wilkie Collins' writing style. I think it's very approachable. I don't think he wastes a lot of words. I think he's excellent at building tension in his stories. They're always dramatic because he writes a lot of sensation novels, which, you know, one of the main things is just the drama. A lot of family drama. They went in very different directions. Some of them, like An Evil Genius, I was a bit on the fence in terms of my rating, but at the end of the day, it was really just like when I compare them to one another, I start to get super picky. But overall, compared to all the books that I read this year, like, yeah, all of these should be 5 stars. And if you want to know where to start with Wilkie Collins, Miss or Mrs. This is a bind-up of 3 stories. Miss or Mrs. is actually just a short novella, but I feel like it contains everything that all of these other books contain in them in a very short snippet. You'll get a sense of the drama that he creates. You'll get a good feel for its sensation novel. You'll get adventure and romance and insanity all in one little book. So yeah, that's where I would start. You should definitely get to The Woman in White. I feel like Basil is a secret surprise that not enough people talk about, and is probably like my second favorite Wilkie Collins. I don't know. I have a really hard time ranking Wilkie Collins, though earlier this year I tried. And The Evil Genius. This is a really good one. It was just the end that kind of puts it down a little lower for me. But yeah, Wilkie Collins. Give him a try. Give these a try. Read these books. And if for some reason you really don't want to read Wilkie Collins and his sensation novels, but you still like drama and want to give a sensation novel a try, see if you can find a copy of A Long Fatal Love Chase. I did a Barnacle Buddy read with this, where I read this live with a whole bunch of other readers, and we discussed, we all got invested super fast into the book, and I read it in one day, and it was worth it. It was a crazy ride. Squirrels crawling out windows. I can't even explain what all happened in this book other than everything. And this is by Louisa May Alcott, if you didn't notice. And yeah, Little Women, yeah, there were no Little Women in this. This was a strong female character who was going to do everything she needed to do during this long, fatal love chase. Yeah, kind of a cheesy title, and definitely a thriller vibe cover, because that's basically how this was marketed when it came out. It was published after she died, but it was something that she wanted published in her lifetime, and they weren't having it. I'm glad somebody eventually published this book because it was really good. Moving on to other books I loved, I have 2 authors that I went back to that I'm very familiar with. The first one being Charles Dickens, and I did read The Mystery of Edwin Drood. This was a 5-star read, and also probably one of the most surprising reads I had this year, just because it's an unfinished work, and I wasn't sure how much I was going to like it because of that, and thought, how good could this possibly be? But the chapters that exist, I really enjoyed. I thought this was a really well put together story. The first chapter is so unbelievably incredibly confusing, and it's supposed to be. And once you realize that, it works so well. I enjoyed everything about this book, and the only thing I didn't like is that it's not finished. But despite that, I still gave it 5 stars. So that just shows how good it ended up being in the end. Another author that I was very familiar with, but I don't think I've read any of his works or haven't in a very long time, though I've seen the movie, would be John Steinbeck. And this year I read Of Mice and Men, a super short novel, a great place to start with John Steinbeck. I was blown away. His writing is just so clear, so descriptive, so lovely, and the themes and the storytelling and the everything that he squeezed into this tiny book just blew my mind, especially because I like a good long book, partially because I feel like you often can't get all of this in a short book. And you can't get all of this in a short book, but John Steinbeck can. So you should give it a try. I have one other author that I've read from before, and this is another book that I've read and reread and reread. Not on purpose. That was just college playing games on me. But I'm glad for that because it's a book that I still love. And to prove it, I reread it this year and yeah, still gave it a 5 star. And that is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. This book, let me tell you, one, Things Fall Apart. It's a spoiler title. Like, just be prepared. It's all going to go to crap. But it goes to crap in a way where even though you start out hating the protagonist and kind of end up hating him, you can relate. Like, it's totally it's not right what goes on in this book, but you get it and you're frustrated and you're mad, not at the book, but at everyone and everything. I annotated this thing so much, but I love it. And I can't wait to read this book again. It is about colonialism and the start of colonialism in Africa, in this village. And you go through these 3 different moments, sort of the before, during, and after. And you just get to see this story that wasn't being told at the time that Chinua Achebe wrote this. And I am so glad that he wrote this book and he told that story. He said that he wrote this book because he felt like there was a book missing on the bookshelves about the African people and their story of colonialism. And man, slot this book in on your shelf because it belongs there. And the final book that I have to mention, last but definitely not least, is Oblomov. Oh, it was such a good reading experience from beginning to end. This book did so much with a guy who wanted to do nothing but sit on the couch. I don't even know how to explain that to you. It's a book about the conflict of relaxing and not wanting to do too much and like how far you can go with that and where it can start to go wrong. And yeah, I loved this book and it changed partway through, which typically I hate. But in this book, I loved it. I loved where this story went. I loved where Oblomov went in his life, and I cried at the end. I was just so moved and so touched by this book. The themes it talked about were so interesting, even though it, like, at one point, sort of the lesson, if you will, got a little bit like, you know, cheesy life lesson. It was still great. I don't know. I just couldn't help myself. I heard people occasionally mention that this was a really good book. It's a really good book. It's a classic. It's one that I don't feel like gets mentioned a lot. It needs to be mentioned more. It was great. I loved it. It was a slow moving character story, but so fascinating. So give it a try and finish it, Anne. Finish the book. Anyway, yeah, that's the last one that I have there. Let me know what your favorite book was of this year, and let me know if you've read any of these and have also liked them. Let me know if you read any of these and hated them. Yeah, whatever you want to say, share it in the comments down below. But that's it for today. The light is fading fast somehow, and I'll try to rescue that in editing. But I will talk to you next time. Bye! Which is the best books of 2025.